and he takes him down. Swarms him.
Big knee, that hurt. This is going to be it. Looking to finish the fight right here. It is all over. Wow. Anderson Silva defeats Stephen Bonner.
On October 13th, 2012, UFC middleweight champion and #1 pound-for-pound fighter Anderson Silva TKO'd Stephan Bonnar in 4 minutes and 40 seconds into the first round to close out the UFC 153 pay-per-view. It feels odd to begin a story with its conclusion, but rest assured, the ending is the only unsurprising and least interesting part of this entire story. For what led to this fairly expected outcome to close out the night in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and the events that surrounded it are nothing short of fascinating, and tell one of the most interesting and bizarre stories in the history of not only the UFC promotion, but also in the history of MMA. UFC 153 was sandwiched in between 2 pay-per-views with the 2 other best MMA fighters in the world at the time. UFC 152 featured rising star and future legend of the sport Jon Jones defending his light heavyweight title against Vitor Belfort in Toronto, Canada. And UFC 154 featured established legend Georges St-Pierre returning after a year-and-a-half-long layoff from injury to face interim welterweight champion Carlos Condit to defend his own belt in Quebec. Anderson Silva, however, wasn't defending his middleweight belt tonight. In fact, a month ago he wasn't even supposed to be on this card, let alone headline it. And the man he faced in the cage that night in Stephan Bonnar clearly had no business being in the cage with him. This was a pay-per-view card put together by Scotch tape and popsicle sticks in order to capitalize on the growing MMA market in the nation of Brazil. Similarly to how the 2 aforementioned cards were trying to capitalize on the also expanding Canadian interest in the sport. The card wasn't always this way though, but a series of injuries and other bizarre circumstances led us to the way the night unfolded. 2012 in general was an extremely bizarre and unfortunate year for the UFC promotion. This was the first full calendar year of their exclusive TV deal with Fox, and to say that things had been a little rocky up to this point in August would be an understatement.
UFC lightweight champion Frankie Edgar and UFC welterweight champion Georges St-Pierre.
The first pay-per-view card of the year was UFC 142, which also took place in Brazil, and headlined by featherweight champion Jose Aldo, who himself would become a future legend of the sport, and is still largely regarded as the best featherweight of all time. He will be a larger part of the story in the near future. But the real drama of that card unfolded in the co-main event of it. Anthony "Rumble" Johnson, who's largely considered one of the most deadly knockout artists in the sport's history, was moving up from welterweight to middleweight to face established Brazilian star Vitor Belfort and missed weight by an incredible 11 pounds. A man who routinely missed weight in the weight class of 170 pounds missed the non-title middleweight limit of 186 pounds by 11 pounds. A physically and mentally drained Rumble would be submitted by Belfort late in the first round and was subsequently released by the promotion. Belfort himself will be a larger part of this story later on as well. As for Rumble, he would move up to light heavyweight outside of the UFC and would go on an absolute tear, returning to the UFC roster a little over 2 years later, where he would become a main staple and fan favorite of the light heavyweight division for 3 more years. The strangeness of Rumble's weight debacle at UFC 142, however, set the stage and tone for the remainder of the year. Over half of the UFC pay-per-views in 2012 lost either its main or co-main event due to injury or scheduling issues. The star of UFC 153, Anderson Silva himself, was subject to a card change earlier in the year when his highly anticipated rematch with Chael Sonnen for his middleweight title was moved from UFC 147 in Brazil to Las Vegas for UFC 148. Though never fully confirmed, it's highly rumored the change occurred because of Chael Sonnen's approach to fight promotion for their rematch.
I mean, I don't have anything against the Brazilian people. I got something against a Brazilian that's sitting a few feet from me. And maybe over the couple other gentlemen, but your women are all okay with me, so feel free to give me a call or pay me a visit. But
while fairly tame by today's trash-talking standards, and very clearly pro-wrestling coded in presentation, Chael's assault on the Brazilian people and their adoration of Silva had become genuine cause for concern. It ultimately didn't matter, as Anderson Silva dispatched Sonnen in fairly quick succession at the scheduled date of UFC 148, but the co-main event of that card had drama of its own. As part of their deal with Fox, the UFC decided to move its tentpole reality series, The Ultimate Fighter, to Fox's premier television programming channel, FX. Not only that, but they decided it would be a great idea to have the fights of the competition live on Friday nights, meaning the show would be filmed and edited almost in real time, as opposed to being filmed, edited, and presented all at different times. This had more consequence than the UFC could have possibly foreseen. Even though the season of the show produced great talent like Michael Chiesa, Raging Al Iaquinta, James Vick, and Darren Cruikshank, the slapdash nature of the production cycle didn't really allow the show or its cast to have a fully fleshed out or consistent narrative. The only true consistent plot within the season was the rivalry between the coaches and reigning bantamweight champion Dominic Cruz and Uriah Faber, who were 1-1 in their rivalry and set to end their trilogy on the 148 card. However, UFC 149, which was set to take place in Calgary, Canada, lost their main event, as Jose Aldo, who was scheduled to defend his featherweight title against journeyman Eric Koch, had to pull out due to injury, and Cruz would tear his ACL in May during the filming of The Ultimate Fighter. Almost like having a training camp in tandem with having to do a reality show isn't the best situation for a professional fighter. And since the show was still filmed and aired on weekly turnarounds, the UFC scrambled to find a replacement fighter to compete against Uriah Faber, now at UFC 149, landing on Jose Aldo's teammate Renan Barão. This ironically caused the co-main event of UFC 148 to be changed to another trilogy that was 1-1 in Tito Ortiz versus Forrest Griffin. A fight that itself ended bizarrely as Forrest Griffin ran out of the octagon immediately after the fight before the decision was read in sheer disappointment with himself, even though he ended up winning the close and entertaining fight on the scorecards. Forrest then proceeded to make matters worse as he hijacked Tito's retirement interview with Joe Rogan and created one of the most uncomfortable and cringe-inducing post-fight interview moments, as Tito was forced to have his final moments in the octagon cage, answering questions from a man he had just barely and agonizingly lost to. UFC president Dana White didn't hold back his criticism of Forrest's antics.
You leave the octagon before the decision is called in the fight that you want? Are you out of your mind? And then he grabs the mic and starts interviewing. I'm not done talking to Forrest yet. Forrest and I are going to talk some more.
This fight would end up marking the end of both fighters' UFC tenure, as Forrest Griffin was the one who actually retired of the two, whereas Tito Ortiz went on to fight in other promotions for 7 years longer. Faber and Cruz, meanwhile, wouldn't have the chance to settle the score for another 4 years. So, how does this all tie together with UFC 153? Well, the original main event of UFC 153 was to be the rescheduled Jose Aldo vs Eric Koch fight, but surprise, surprise, Koch was injured in August and he himself had to pull out of his title fight with Aldo. Koch would proceed to go 3-5 in his next 8 fights, never getting a title opportunity again, but he did get to close out his career on a win. So who did the UFC find to replace Koch? Why, one of the best fighters in the world at the time in Frankie Edgar, who was just coming off of 2 very close lightweight title fight losses to the much larger man in Benson Henderson, after Edgar had defended the belt 3 times previously. Edgar was always very small for a lightweight, and a move down to a lighter weight class was inevitable. Although it was relatively short notice, Edgar's debut at featherweight against the greatest fighter in that weight class's history was intriguing enough to sell on that alone, as well as the fact that the vast majority felt that Edgar had clearly won his rematch against Benson Henderson earlier that month. Alas, that was also not meant to be, as in early September Jose Aldo injured his foot during a motorcycle accident of all things, and had to pull out of that fight as well, leading to Aldo and Edgar settling the impromptu score in February of 2013. 2012 was already a cursed year, but the timing of this injury to Aldo could not come at a worse time. Just a few weeks prior to Aldo's injury, on August 23rd, Dana White hosted a phone call press conference where he announced that the entirety of the UFC 151 card was cancelled. The main event was scheduled to be Jon Jones versus Dan Henderson for the light heavyweight title. However, Dan Henderson had to pull out of the bout just weeks before it was to take place due to an MCL injury, and not only that, but Jon Jones had refused to fight Chael Sonnen on 8 days' notice. This led to the aforementioned canceling of the event, and for Dana White to go on an infamous rant to the media members against Jon Jones and calling his coach a sport killer. A rant that caused a rift between Jones and the promotion that has arguably never truly recovered. As a result, UFC 153 would lose another one of its popular Brazilian stars in Vitor Belfort, who was coming off of his win over Anthony Rumble Johnson, and was scheduled to fight fellow middleweight veteran Alan Belcher. Belfort was pulled from that card and fought Jon Jones in Toronto at UFC 152, a fight card that wasn't without its own myriad of fighter pullouts and controversies, the most consequential being that Belfort failed a drug test for elevated testosterone prior to the fight. However, the UFC allowed the fight to continue, likely due to the financial strain the year of pullouts and cancellations was placing on the company. This could have been disastrous as early in the fight, Belfort locked in a submission that Jon Jones barely got out of. Thankfully, Jones dominated the remainder of the fight, and while still very unpopular with the fans and the UFC brass, Jones winning probably saved the UFC a lot of additional hassle that night. So, you have a UFC that's nearly a year into the most important TV deal of their existence at the time, is struggling to keep a single card together, is likely not in the most secure place financially, and has a pay-per-view in one of their current major markets coming up with no headliner in less than a month. So what do? Well, they call in the Spider. Now, at this point in his career, Anderson Silva was at the absolute peak of his popularity. While the most dominant champion in UFC history up until that point, Anderson Silva wasn't always a UFC superstar. Now well into his mid-30s, Anderson Silva had been the middleweight champion since the fall of 2006. In fact, the date of UFC 153, October 13th, 2012, was only a day shy of the 6th anniversary of him winning the belt. However, up until the last 2 years of his championship reign, the Spider was overshadowed in popularity by his contemporaries in names such as George St. Pierre and Brock Lesnar. Silva would also play down to his competition and do just enough to win certain fights against lesser opponents that he was expected to steamroll. He also didn't speak English, and his natural voice was high-pitched and awkward.
O adversário perceber que você está lesionado.
Silva had been competing in MMA since 1997 and had fought in many promotions, including Pride FC, and just now, 15 years into his professional career, he was considered a big enough star to save an entire pay-per-view card when the UFC needed a savior most. If you were to say to Dana White after the disastrous UFC 112 event and would turn to him in a dire need for a pay-per-view headliner a little more than 2 years later, he'd probably call you a dummy and ban you from covering events. It took his rivalry with Chael Sonnen and an all-time great head kick KO on Vitor Belfort for casual fans to finally take notice, and for Anderson Silva to put some of the best performances of his title reign and to the largest audience possible. While riding an unbeaten 15-fight winning streak, it's unfortunate that Silva found his popularity so late into his career, but this would become a trend with many a UFC star going forward. The opponent chosen to headline against him at UFC 153, however, was more of a head-scratcher at this point. As far as accomplishments go, Stephan Bonnar was little more than a journeyman himself if you look at his career. But suffice to say, unlike the win-loss record of his career would suggest, Stephan Bonnar may have saved the entire UFC company in April of 2005 when he competed against Forrest Griffin in the Ultimate Fighter Season 1 finale on Spike TV. Unlike Griffin, however, Bonnar would have a roller coaster of a career in the UFC after that razor-thin decision loss, which would see him lose to the vast majority of every notable fight he took part in, including a layup fight against a 45-year-old Mark Coleman. But in September of 2012, Bonnar was riding a 3-fight winning streak and was looking for one final big fight to close out his career at the age of 35.
I'd like to go out in a blaze of glory, fight the guys I really want to fight.
Bonnar answered the call for this card, and thus, Anderson Silva vs. Stephan Bonnar was announced as the main event of the UFC 153 pay-per-view card. But before we circle back to the aforementioned first-round finish of Bonnar from Anderson Silva that we mentioned at the beginning of this video, there are plenty of odd stories and narratives involving many of the other names on this card that made for a fascinating evaluation. The co-main event saw another aging Brazilian veteran in Antonio Nogueira, more associated with his nickname of Big Nog, securing the final win of his legendary career against a failed heavyweight prospect in Dave Herman. Big Nog had seen and fought everywhere and everyone there was to know in the heavyweight division for over a decade, winning the vast majority of those fights, which led to him wearing both Pride and UFC Heavyweight Championship belts, even if the UFC belt was an interim belt. Going into UFC 153, Big Nog was 36 and was 2-3 in his last 5 fights. And while he had put on respectable performances against fellow veteran Randy Couture and derailed the hype train of heavyweight prospect and future podcaster Brendan Schaub, his 3 losses were all fairly devastating. 2 losses to former UFC champion Frank Mir, one where he was TKO'd and lost his interim title, and the other where Frank broke his arm after Nogueira refused to tap. The loss he suffered in between his losses to Mir could be considered a true passing of the heavyweight torch, where he was KO'd in the main event of a pay-per-view by future heavyweight champion Cain Velasquez, who ushered in a new breed of heavyweights into the 2010 decade. However, Big Nog turned back the clock one final time in his native home of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, when he put down and submitted Dave Herman in the final minute of the second round. Big Nog would go on to lose 3 more fights before calling it a career, his final fight being a lackluster decision loss to Stefan Struve in 2015, again taking place in Rio. I guess it could have been worse. His opponent Dave Herman was once poised to be alongside the aforementioned Cain Velasquez, ushering in a new breed of heavyweight contender, especially after his UFC debut win in 2011. However, Herman failed to live up to expectations, losing all of his subsequent UFC fights, including the loss to Big Nog at UFC 153. Herman was released from the UFC following one more loss, his UFC record a depressing 1-4. One fighter that did eventually live up to his expectations was the winner of the fight that took place before the Nog-Herman fight, Glover Teixeira. While Glover's entrance into the UFC was delayed due to constant visa issues, the Brazilian was considered by many to be the best talent in the sport outside of the UFC promotion. However, the 32-year-old made good on the forum discussion hype when he arrived in April of 2012 and quickly dispatched of Kyle Kingsbury in less than a round on the Facebook prelims of UFC 146. UFC 153 was Glover Teixeira's coming out party, and he put on a generational beating on light heavyweight gatekeeper Fabio Maldonado. Well, aside from a sneaky punch from Fabio that nearly knocked Glover out on his feet late in the first round. Glover would nearly suffer the same type of defeat a year later when he fought Ryan Bader in Brazil and was nearly put out again by a punch he didn't see coming. After failing to win the title off of John Jones and some losses that again highlighted Glover's compromised ability to take damage, well into his late 30s, Teixeira revamped his game to focus much more on his top-heavy grappling game than his boxing. This led the Brazilian to the longest win streak in his entire UFC career, with him eventually winning the light heavyweight title at 42 years old in 2021. While winning a UFC title at 42 is a big surprise, arguably the biggest surprise of the night of UFC 153 came from the third fight of the pay-per-view. Traditionally, most UFC pay-per-view main cards are 5 fights, but UFC 153 was an odd exception, having 6 fights on the docket, giving buyers slightly more bang for their buck. The first 2 fights were solid performances from UFC mainstays Damian Maia and Phil Davis, but served more as tasty appetizers to the 4 fights of madness to follow. The third fight had easily the most at stake for both men involved. Eric Silva was a Brazilian prospect who at one point was seen as a potential superstar. He looked like a supermodel, had insane athleticism, and a very exciting and aggressive fighting style. However, that aggressive fighting style had already gotten him in trouble less than a full year into his UFC tenure. Silva should have been entering this fight on a 3-fight winning streak. However, in his second fight with the promotion at UFC 142, the Aldo headlined pay-per-view we mentioned earlier, in his eagerness to finish off his opponent, Eric Silva landed numerous punches to the back of the head which were illegal. When the fight was called off, initially Eric thought he had won, but alas, it was actually a disqualification loss. After a rebound win in June, Eric Silva was booked at UFC 153 against his toughest test by far, a bump in competition so drastic it likely wouldn't have been made in today's UFC climate. Eric Silva was pitted against a man many consider the greatest welterweight to have never worn UFC gold, John Fitch. John Fitch was a fighter that requires more context than likely any fighter in welterweight history. A man who went on both an 8-fight win streak and a 5-fight win streak in the UFC. The only man that prevented a total 14-fight win streak was the greatest welterweight of all time, George St. Pierre, in Fitch's single title fight attempt. However, heading into his fight with Silva, Fitch was coming off a knockout loss to welterweight powerhouse Johnny Hendricks in the first round, and a draw to a very out-of-his-prime BJ Penn. The UFC was absolutely desperate in hoping this meant a decline in Fitch's athletic prime, which is why they booked him against such a hot prospect in Eric Silva. But why, you may ask? Well, John Fitch committed the most egregious sin as a UFC fighter. Did he commit crimes and assault people outside the cage? No. Was he a notorious drug cheat who failed numerous tests and affected many cards and fighters? No. John Fitch was boring. In his 18 fights within the UFC, John Fitch only finished 4 of them, and his only TKO win was a fluke upkick KO of Thiago Alves in a fight he was handily losing beforehand. And these weren't the kind of decisions that Khabib Nurmagomedov, Merab Dvalishvili, or even GSP put on. John Fitch's fights, by and large, absolutely sucked. Fitch fought in a time within the UFC where stalling during grappling and wrestling exchanges weren't as heavily penalized or scrutinized. Unlike Pride FC, which handed out yellow cards for inactivity, the early UFC was largely dominated by strong American wrestlers and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu grapplers, and thus the rules set and judging criteria largely favored their fighting style. This would result in many fights being long, awkward, and painfully boring affairs where one fighter would secure a takedown and position on the ground, and instead of using their energy to try and finish the fight, they'd use that energy for the much more conservative approach of controlling their opponent and not allowing them to get back on their feet or mount any offense from bottom position. This strategy was known by the MMA community as lay and pray, and there was no fighter that embraced that philosophy more than John Fitch. Fitch was not an athletic fighter. He did not have fast or powerful striking. He did not have strong or explosive takedowns or ground and pound. He just had relentless, stifling, and annoying pressure. The UFC brass hated booking fights with Fitch, and hated even more so that he would derail fan favorites like Diego Sanchez and the aforementioned Thiago Alves. The UFC begrudgingly granted John Fitch a title shot against George St. Pierre at UFC 87 after Fitch secured an 8-fight winning streak. Thankfully, GSP put an absolute beatdown on the wrestler and not only completely outstruck Fitch, but dominated in the wrestling as well, nearly finishing Fitch on multiple occasions. Unfortunately for the UFC, this wouldn't result in Fitch changing his fighting style or declining in dominance. Fitch not only continued to win fights, but he arguably fought even more conservatively. The UFC was so sick of him they even aired his fight with Paulo Thiago at UFC 100 after the explosive main event between Brock Lesnar and Frank Mir was already over.
Don't go anywhere, because we still got one more fight. John Fitch and Paulo Thiago's coming up next.
Giving the fight as little fanfare and viewer interest as humanly possible. However, as previously mentioned, John Fitch came into his UFC 153 fight with Eric Silva on a knockout loss and a draw in his previous 2 fights. Fitch had also been sidelined for nearly a year with injuries and had been getting injured more often. It seemed that the UFC was nearly rid of their John Fitch-sized entertainment problem. However, in the lead up to the fight, John Fitch admitted that he was nearly flat broke, and that he had taken the previous fight in which he was knocked out, injured, because he was financially hurting then as well, going so far to say that he would take the fight injured again because of the financial burden he was under.
If I had to go back in time and do it again, I would have done the exact same thing, knowing the result.
Why didn't you have a choice?
I needed the money. I couldn't afford, I had a pregnant wife at home, I had 2 mortgages, I could not financially afford not to take that fight.
Fitch had every reason to put on the fight of his life, and against Eric Silva, he did just that. Not only did Fitch win the fight against Silva, but the fight was absolutely thrilling, winning fight of the night even. On a card with names like Anderson Silva, Glover Teixeira, and Big Nog on it, John Fitch winning fight of the night was not only shockingly bizarre, but had to be absolutely liberating for Fitch. Unfortunately for Fitch, this would be the final highlight of his UFC career. After Fitch's next fight, where he was dominated on the ground by Damian Maia, in ironically the same way Fitch used to smother his past opponents, he was unceremoniously cut by the UFC. A decision that shocked many fans, but it wasn't exactly like the public was clamoring for another John Fitch fight. As for Eric Silva, he would never truly live up to his potential after this fight, trading wins and losses where he would still occasionally flash signs of brilliance, but would eventually end his tenure with the promotion with a losing record of 7-8. And now we get back to this image, and the ending of this card's roller coaster of a journey. There was nothing surprising about Anderson Silva versus Stephan Bonnar. Silva dispatched of Bonnar late in the first round, even toying with Bonnar at some point and allowing himself to be pressed against the cage by the much larger man to show how little he feared Bonnar's offense. A knee to the gut shortly after shut Bonnar down, and combined with Big Nog turning the clock back in the co-main event, the Brazilian crowd and watchers at home left the event satisfied. But with a card like UFC 153, the madness doesn't end when the lights in the arena go out. No one would have possibly thought that after that night ended, that his quick work of Bonnar would be Anderson Silva's last win in the octagon for nearly 5 years. He would go on to lose his next 2 fights and his middleweight title to Chris Weidman, the second fight ending in a devastating leg break injury. Silva would then win a timid decision against Nick Diaz in his return fight, but would test positive for steroids, tarnishing his legacy and the win being overturned in the process. He would win the fans back with a Fight of the Year candidate against Michael Bisping in 2016, a fight in which he narrowly lost, but would then lose an extremely short notice replacement fight against Daniel Cormier that July at UFC 200. At 0-4-1 in his last 5, it was clear. The end of the spider's web of terror in the UFC truly spun its last thread with his victory over Bonnar. But while Anderson was able to find ways to have a successful career post-prime, the same could not be said for his opponent, Stephan Bonnar. Some time after UFC 153 ended, it was announced that Bonnar had failed a pre-fight drug test for anabolic steroids. While already a bad look for Bonnar, the timing of this could not have been worse, all things considered. This was a pay-per-view event that was desperately needed after all the fight cancellations, and the UFC being in that first year of their Fox deal. This was already following the UFC looking the other way in their previous pay-per-view, where Vitor Belfort tested positive for elevated testosterone, a controversy that wouldn't be revealed to the public for over 2 years after the fact. Had Bonnar somehow, someway managed to defeat the UFC's #1 pound-for-pound fighter, and for it to be revealed that he was juicing, would be catastrophic for the UFC in every way imaginable. This ruined Bonnar's relationship with the UFC for an extended period of time, and would trigger the beginning of a long series of events that would eventually end with Bonnar's passing 10 years later in 2022, where the man once considered to be a savior of the sport died broke, homeless, and consumed by addiction. Who knows how different Bonnar's life path would have played out had he not taken that short notice call against Anderson Silva? Who knows how many stories would have played out differently if the card stayed intact the way it was supposed to? But that question could apply to an untold number of events in combat sports. There's a reason why the tagline, "Card subject to change," is featured on every promotion for every card. But never has that tagline been so apropos and impactful as it was for UFC 153. It truly was the weirdest UFC card in history.